Thank you to Georgia Perimeter College and to Robin Jenkins and Jack Riggs especially for bringing me here today. It's actually my second trip to Georgia Perimeter College. I had the pleasure of coming to the Dunwoody campus in March. And I'd also like to acknowledge Judith Costello, the Canadian consulate, who organized that trip that I took in the U.S. Southeast in March. She's here as well today. I'm a Canadian and the product of American parents. Of my black father and white mother left Washington, D.C. the day after they married in 1953 and moved to Canada and never turned around and went back. And they became sort of pioneers in the human rights movement in Canada and historians about the history of African Canadians. And I'm sort of a product of that upbringing with a foot in both countries, family-wise, really. And I'll tell you a little story that, with apologies to Robin and Judith, who've heard this before, some people ask how is it that I did become a writer, or what led me to feel passionate about writing in the first place. And I can't tell you that it's the only kind of work that I do feel passionate about. It's the only kind of work I really do is to write. And I feel quite fortunate to have something that I love to do. And if I could encourage you to look to one thing as you move forward out of your studies, is to find something that you feel passionate and excited about and go there. Life is so much more worth living when you have something that excites you, whatever it is. Find that and go there. When I was 6 or so, I wanted desperately to have, as any sort of normal 6-year-old will have intense desires, I wanted to have a kitten, as my friend down the street had a cat that had a litter of kittens. So I asked my father if I could have one of these kittens, and he said, "No, Larry, you can't." And you have to sort of picture a fairly austere, relatively domineering in the domestic household African-American father who was obsessed with the notion that his children should become educated and hyper-professional to sort of escape the ravages of the discrimination and segregation that he'd faced. He was, among other things, in a highly segregated American army in the Second World War, so he knew all about how you were good enough to die for your country at war, but not good enough to live in an integrated state afterwards. And so, and his experiences at war were partly what led him to leave the United States and move to Canada after he married my mother. So he was obsessed that we should become educated, as he was, and as his own father and mother and grandparents were, in order to sort of mitigate against the possibilities of racism. And so I asked for this kitten. I was 6, and I could manage block letters at the time, but I couldn't yet write in cursive script. And he said, "No, you can't have this kitten." And I asked the second time if I could have the cat. He said, "No, you can't have it." And I asked the third time, on the third day, if I could please have this kitten. He said, "No, Larry, you can't have the cat. But go up to your bedroom and write me a letter. And tell me in this letter why you deserve to have this kitten, and whose allowance will pay for its cat food, and how you'll prevent it from having babies in the closet. And if you can write me a well-rendered letter with no spelling mistakes, I'll give your request due consideration." And I tell you, there's nothing like wanting something to lend a sense of passion to your writing. I wasn't writing a letter in the abstract. I wasn't just writing a letter to fool around. I was writing a letter because I wanted something. I had to persuade somebody who was sitting downstairs at the kitchen table, arms crossed across his chest. "Impress me" was really what was sitting on his face. That was his attitude. "Impress me. Impress me with these words of yours." And I had to impress him. I had to convince him and cajole him and persuade him. And so for me, the first act of writing was a highly political and highly selfish act, which isn't a bad thing at all. You should be a bit selfish and political, and should be looking for something when you write. You should be looking to mine some passion, and I wanted that cat, so I took to that writing, and I haven't stopped since. And he was smart enough to give me that kitten, and from that point on, anytime I ever wanted to have anything again, I had to write another letter for it. And so I became an inveterate letter writer at an early age, and I haven't stopped since then. I really have been passionate about writing from that time. Began writing stories with some gusto when I was 14 or 15, and started publishing, books when I was about 30 or so, after working for a few years as a newspaper reporter. So that's a bit about my background. I'll be happy to answer your questions. I believe we have to be wrapped up by 11:50. Is that correct? Do I have that right? I'm just checking in terms of... Yes. So what I'll do is I'm going to talk to you for about 5 minutes about the history underpinning this novel, Someone Knows My Name. Then I'm going to read to you briefly from the book, short enough, I hope, that nobody starts to snore while I'm reading. I'll just give you a 5 or 10 minute reading, talk to you for 5 or 10 minutes about the history underneath the book, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions and chat with you. And I believe there's a reception afterwards as well. This is a historical novel. It's set primarily in the 18th century, and it follows the life of a woman, an African woman, really from her birth or close to it to the last days of her life. An 18th century African woman who travels around the world, back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, initially in chains, and later on a free woman hoping to going home to the mother continent and hoping to find her way literally home, if it's possible. I want to tell you a bit about how I came across the story and what the historical underpinnings of it are. And although I could go on at length, I'll keep it brief. This is a story of a woman who reflects a historical migration of people who are known as the Black Loyalists, who were Americans as well as Canadians as well as Africans, but they're quite unknown in this country and in Canada. And part of the reason for writing this book was to raise their profile, which I think has been sadly forgotten. The Black Loyalists were people of African descent who were brought, of course, forcibly in chains into the United States. And, really, it was called the 13 colonies at the time. They were colonies of Great Britain. This is prior to the American Revolutionary War. And during the American Revolutionary War, of course, many of you, or perhaps all of you, will know that many proud African Americans served on the side of the rebels, those who fought for and obtained independence for the United States, a country that became the United States of America. And the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks, fighting for the rebels, fighting for those who would go on to form the United States of America. And even I, growing up in Canada, couldn't escape knowing by the time I was 10 that the first person to die in this American Revolutionary War was indeed a black man serving the rebel cause, or at least siding with the rebels. But it's also true that thousands of blacks also chose to serve on the side of the British, who fought against the Americans in this war, who failed to quash the American Revolution, and who eventually had to hightail it out of what became the United States. How did this come about? Well, during this long 7 or 8 year war, the British, who were controlling the colonies, put out written proclamations to African Americans, promising them freedom in exchange for service in the war. The deal was, if you came to serve the British during the American Revolution, you would be offered freedom and security in exchange for the service that you provide during the war. So I guess you had to decide who was more likely to protect your interests and who was more likely to guarantee your security after the war. So thousands chose to serve the British. Because Manhattan was the last bastion of British control during the war, because New York City was the one place that the British held to the last minute of the American Revolutionary War, it was to New York City that thousands of African Americans repaired. They fled there, fleeing the chains of slavery to serve the British in the war. And serve them they did, men and women with their children in tow, thousands. They served them as soldiers, spies, cooks, road builders, prostitutes, midwives, you name it, they did it in every way imaginable. And at the end of the war, when the British lost, what's to happen to these African Americans who've served the British in the war, who've been promised their freedom by the British, but the British have lost? And the British are they're sailing out of the city just as fast as they can go. So what's to happen to the blacks who served them? As it turns out, the British come up with a system to guarantee passage to African Americans who can show that they served at least a year behind British military lines in New York City. And if you can demonstrate that, your name is entered into a document, a British military document known as the Book of Negroes. This document is kept in the New York Public Library and various other archives around the world. This front page of the book, end papers really, shows a photocopy of one of the many 150 pages of the Book of Negroes, which contains the names of 3,000 African Americans. And it's the first time in the history of the United States that thousands of African Americans are publicly documented by name, age, whom they used to be owned by, how they came to flee the state of slavery, how they served during the war, and where they're going now that the war's ended and they're fleeing Manhattan before the Americans take it over again. Are they going to Nova Scotia, London, England, Germany, the Caribbean, Quebec City? Where are they going? Most of them end up going to Nova Scotia, which is, as you know, a province on the east coast of Canada, on the Atlantic coast, really due north, following the seaboard, and due north from here, I should say. And so that's where they go. And after 10 years in Nova Scotia, where they encounter unexpected segregation, discrimination, and slavery, they finally are so fed up with the broken promises of racial oppression in Nova Scotia that they leave. And they accept an offer from the British government to sail to Africa to found the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa. This becomes the first time in the history of the Americas that thousands of people, black people, are leaving the Americas and going to Africa. It turns out they're not just going to Africa from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Many of them are going back. Many of these 1,200 black men, women, and children sailing in 15 ships from Halifax, Canada to Africa in 1792, January 15, 1792, are going back. They've been born in Africa, stolen in their childhood or early adulthood, sent into slavery in the Americas, brought up to Canada in the way I've just described after serving the British in the war, and then they're going back to Africa in the same lifetime in which they were stolen from their homelands. And this is a story that's largely unexplored and unknown in North America, and it's a story that forms the crux of this novel. So my character engages in the same migration that affected thousands of African Americans known as these Black Loyalists. Born in Africa, brought into the Sea Islands of South Carolina, up to New York City during the war, over to Nova Scotia, Canada, right after the American Revolution, back to Africa 10 years later. This year, 2008, is the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the American slave trade. Slavery, of course, didn't die until 1865, really, formally, but the slave trade is eradicated by Congress in 1808. And that's a precursor to the ultimate abolition of slavery. That is an abolition of the trading of peoples, the importation of Africans into slavery in the United States. A year before that, British abolishes the British slave trade. That's significant because Britain is the leading slave trading nation of the world at this time. And my character, Aminata, as Jack Riggs mentioned, goes to London, England at the very end of her life to advocate for the abolition of the British slave trade. It's a long 20-year fight that she steps into near the end of her life after this tumultuous life back and forth across the ocean. So I'm going to read to you a few pages in the voice of Aminata, my protagonist. So she tells her story, which becomes this novel. So this novel is told entirely in the voice of her. And I'll read to you the first pages of the book, where she's an old woman in London, looking back over her life and some of the things that she's done before she takes you blow by blow through her life as it unfolded chronologically. I seem to have trouble dying. By all rights, I should not have lived this long. But I can still smell trouble riding on any wind, just as surely as I could tell you whether there's a stew of chicken necks or pig's feet bubbling in the iron pot on the fire. And my ears still work just as good as a hound dog's. People assume that just because you don't stand straight as a sapling, you're deaf, or that your mind is the texture of pumpkin mush. The other day, when I was being led into a meeting with a bishop, one of the society ladies told another, "We must get this woman into Parliament soon. Who knows how much longer she'll be with us?" Half bent though I was, I dug my fingers into her ribs. She let out a shriek and spun around to face me. "Careful," I told her. "I may outlast you." There must be a reason why I've lived in all these lands, survived all those water crossings, while others fell from bullets or shut their eyes or simply willed their lives to end. In the earliest days, when I was free and knew nothing other, I used to sneak outside our walled compound, climb straight up the acacia tree while balancing Father's Koran on my head, sit way out on a branch and wonder how I might one day unlock all the mysteries contained in the book. feet swinging beneath me, I would put down the book, the only one I'd seen in Bayeux, and look out at the patchwork of mud walls and thatched coverings. People were always on the move. Women carrying water from the river. Men working iron in the fires. Boys returning triumphant from the forest with snared porcupines. It's a lot of work, extracting meat from a porcupine, but if they had no other pressing chores, they would do it anyway. Removing the quills, skinning the animal, slicing out the innards, practicing with their sharp knives on the pathetic little carcasses. In those days I felt free and happy, and the very idea of safety never intruded on my thoughts. I have escaped violent endings even as they have surrounded me, but I never had the privilege of holding on to my children, living with them, raising them the way my own parents raised me for 10 or 11 years, until all of our lives were torn asunder. I never managed to keep my own children long, which explains why they are not here with me now, making my meals, adding straw to my bedding, bringing me a cape to hold off the cold, sitting with me by the fire with the knowledge that they had emerged from my loins, and that our shared moments had grown like cornstalks in damp soil. Others take care of me now, and that's a fine thing, but it's not the same as having one's own flesh and blood to cradle one toward the grave. I long to hold my own children, and their children, if they exist, and I miss them the way I miss limbs from my own body. They have me exceedingly busy here in London. They say I'm to meet King George. About me, I have a clutch of abolitionists, big-whiskered, wide-bellied, bald-headed men boycotting sugar but smelling of tobacco and burning candle after candle as they plot deep into the night. The abolitionists say that they brought me to England to help them change the course of history. Well, we shall see about that. But if I've lived this long, it must be for a reason. Fa means father in my language. Ba means river. It also means mother. In my early childhood, my ba was like a river, flowing on and on and on with me through the days and keeping me safe at night. Most of my lifetime has come and gone, but I still think of them as my parents, older and wiser than I. I still hear their voices, sometimes big-chested, at other moments floating like musical notes. I imagine their hands steering me from trouble, guiding me around cooking fires and leading me to the mat in the cool shade of our home. I can still picture my father with a sharp stick over hard earth, scratching out Arabic in flowing lines and speaking of the distant Timbuktu. In private moments, when the abolitionists are not swirling about like tornadoes, seeking my presence in this deputation or my signature atop that petition, I wish my parents were still here to care for me. Isn't that strange? Here I am, a broken-down old black woman who's crossed more water than I care to remember, and walked more leagues than a workhorse. And the only things I dream of are things I can't have: children and grandchildren to love, and parents to care for me. The other day they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was the famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I was Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata. 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She said she was born that way. Same here, I replied. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You would be prettier if London never got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you eat raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging through villages and stand still long enough for me to take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I ate what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodile, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to please tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. As I told her, I am Aminata Diallo, daughter of Mamadou Diallo and Sira Koulibaly, born in the village of Bayo, 3 moons by foot from the grain coast in West Africa. I am a Bamana and a Fula. I am both, and we'll explain that later. I suspect I was born in 1745, or close to it. Thank you. We have about 12 minutes, so I'd be very happy to take any questions or comments if you have any. Yes? The question is, some sections of my novel read like poetry, very lyrical, and do I write poetry as well? First of all, thank you. That's a lovely thing to say. And for the betterment of humanity, I don't write poetry because I think I would be very bad at it. But I do believe in beautiful language, and I love all sorts of different kinds of writing. I like when I write, and often when I read, but not always, I like a simple language and one that concerns itself with how it enters the ear. And I've always believed that writing, when you read, writing first enters your senses through the ear. It's not really entering you through the eye. It's coming in through the ear, even though you're reading it privately. And so I think it's important to pay attention to the rhythm and the sound of language. And I certainly was educated as such in reading as a young boy and as a young man. So I look for a sound that sounds appetizing, that sounds enticing, really. Yes?
Why don't she have her children?
I beg your pardon?
Why don't she have her children?
Why doesn't she have her children? Well, like so many people who are brought into chains, she doesn't control necessarily where her own life is heading or what will happen to her or what will happen to her children. And so her children are removed from her for profit, by people who own her and own the children. And she has to go on being a midwife, catching other people's babies, but losing her own. And this is a very difficult balance to maintain in her life. So it's kind of at the crux of one of her emotional challenges in life. Yes?
I have a question. The gentleman mentioned that you majored in economics and then you went on to get a master's in writing. Did you find it difficult to stop thinking like an economist and economist and think more like a writer to become a creative writer? My second question is, do you require your children to write letters for things that they really want?
So there's a two-part question. First of all, was it hard to sort of leave the world of studying economics to become a creative writer? And the second one was, do I require my own children to write letters for the things that they want? I'll answer the second half first, as it's the more entertaining part of the question. My children, I don't require them to write letters. I have 5, and they range in age from 9 to 18. The first one actually just went off to college a few days ago, so I had the privilege and the pain of sending her off to another city and saying goodbye, because I don't imagine she'll be living at home permanently again. She's gone off to Montreal, which is about 7 hours by car from where I live in Ontario. They've never been required to write letters, but when they want something and they really want it, they know to write a letter because they know their chances of getting it are increased. Because it's very hard for me to say no to a child who's written a letter for something. Because if they've taken the trouble to write, then I feel they should be rewarded for it. And they've never abused it, so they don't ask for something they know they can't have in a letter. But if it's iffy, if it's touchy, if it's negotiable, they'll write a letter, and they know that increases vastly the chances of their getting it, because they know that I want to reward them for having made that effort. So they do write when they really want something, and they're not sure they're going to get it. But they do it on their own steam, not because I make them. And I never really wanted to become an economist. When I went to university in the 1970s to do my undergraduate degree, the economy was a lot different than now. It was easy to get work. And I just studied economics because I was tired of hearing my parents talk constantly about race relations and black history and sociology, and I just wanted to do something else at university that embraced everything that my parents represented. And so I was just trying to expand my worldview and open up the horizon to become a journalist, because it helps to know something about economics if you're going to write for newspapers. So it was really just a way to broaden my own horizons. I knew well before going to university that I was going to write, and I was going to try to make that my life. So it wasn't so much leaving economics to go to writing, but using economics as an interlude to study something and then to get a job out of it for a while, as I had to work for a few years out of university to pay for my habit, my writing habit, which is an expensive habit indeed. You're welcome. Yes?
Did all of the British redcoats make it back to England, and those that didn't, did they become prisoners? Or
that's a great question. Did all of the British redcoats, and for those of you who don't know, the redcoats, of course, are those fighting for the British, did they make it back to England, or did they become imprisoned? Both sides during the American Revolutionary War, and very much the British, committed terrible atrocities during that war. And one of the worst atrocities that they committed was the treatment of prisoners of war. And thousands upon thousands of American soldiers fighting for the rebels, fighting for those who formed the United States, were imprisoned in terrible conditions by the British during the war and died in these squalid conditions during the war. British redcoats were also kept imprisoned by the American rebels. Did all of the British manage to get out? Certainly most of them did. In the case of New York, what happened was that the Americans and the British signed a peace treaty in Paris about 6 months before the formal end of the war, before the hostilities were entirely over and the war was finally won. So the British had 6 months to pull out of Manhattan. So it's not like they all had to scramble out in 6 hours or they'd be taken. They had 6 months to pull out, from about March or so, or April, till about November of 1783. They had that window to get out. And so they were getting out as fast as they could, and the Black Loyalists were trying to get out too. But if you were black in New York City, you're on the bottom of the totem pole, and you could not get out of Manhattan unless you had the permission of the British Navy. It's an island, as you know. It was totally policed by the British Navy, which was the most powerful navy in the world. And so the only way you were getting out of New York City was by the permission of the British. And so that's why it was so difficult for blacks to get out. I believe that most, or pretty well most, of the British officers and soldiers did get out, unless perhaps they were held in prison prior to the end of the war. And I don't know what, there might have been some sort of release of prisoners exchange near the end of the war. I'm not sure about that. It's not a detail that I know about exactly. But the British who were in Manhattan got out. Yes, they did.
What about the black? Did most of the blacks get out?
Well, there were 3,000 blacks who were listed in the Book of Negroes and who were evacuated from Manhattan and taken mostly to Nova Scotia, Canada. A few go to Germany and England and the Caribbean, but almost all, like 95%, are going to the east coast of Canada. Now there were blacks working for and siding with the rebels as well. So not all blacks were on the side of the British in New York City. And I think that some are said to have managed to have escaped in small numbers in private boats and so forth, but that would have been difficult to do, and getting somewhere safe would have been difficult as well. But there were 3,000 blacks entered into the Book of Negroes, which makes it, again, the first time in the history of the United States that thousands of black people are publicly, formally named in writing. Their names, their origins, what they look like even, where they're going, where they've been, who they used to be owned by, how they served the British in the war. So it's a very interesting document that you can use to trace these movements back and forth in time, because if you see them in the Book of Negroes, which I've done, then you can find out where they used to live, say in South Carolina or Georgia or North Carolina prior to the war, and you can find out where they went after the war. So it's a tracking device if you're interested in studying the movement of these people over a generation or two. I'll take another question from another person just so we can spread it around. Yes? How long did it take to research the book? The entire process took about 5 years. That would include researching and writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting until the cows come home, as Jack Briggs and other writers in the audience know all about that. It's nothing particularly unusual about my process. I tend to write fast and then rewrite a great deal. But as it is a historical novel, and as I did strive to be as faithful as I could to the history as I understood it, there was a great deal of research, and it spread out the entirety of the 5 years. I was researching to the last minute to check things, at the last minute that I wanted to be sure of. So about 5 years. Yes.
You make brief references to the Sea Islands, and we know that there is a culture there that's still alive. Have you researched it very much to find out what contributes to not only their survival but their viability, knowing that they've had many challenges?
Are you referring to the Gullah or the Geechee people?
Yes,
absolutely. I went to, when in researching the novel, I went to many of the locations where the book is set, including St. Helena Island, and I went many times to Hilton Head just to have a place to stay cheaply, or Beaufort and the like. And also, of course, to Manhattan, as my character moves from the Sea Islands to Manhattan. The story of the Gullah peoples, and really the early black peoples of South Carolina, is one of the most interesting and unique stories of Africans in America. And it's so unique because, unlike other parts of the United States where slavery flourished, in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, of course, we have the mosquito. And the mosquito is a killer. Malaria is very, very present in the 18th century in the islands of South Carolina. It will kill people with great frequency. It does kill with great frequency. And the Africans who are brought there have some, not entirely, but have some natural immunities, more so than do the whites, to malaria and to the mosquito, which is a vector of malaria. The mosquito isn't known to be the thing that causes malaria at the time. People think it's the odors from the swamps and things like that, but they know what the sick season is. And the sick season where people die of malaria is anywhere from the spring to the fall, which is about a 6-month time frame. So in the 6 months where mosquitoes are most active in the Sea Islands, the people who own plantations in the Sea Islands of South Carolina leave for higher ground to be away from the swampy sick season. And so what that means is that unlike any other part of the United States, people who are enslaved in the Sea Islands are enslaved and live alone and are monitored by each other and have black overseers, and they live in almost complete isolation from white people for about 6 months of the year. They are entirely black communities, pretty well 100%. And this is in the 18th century, so the mid to late 1700s. It's a fascinating culture, which is unlike any other culture in the United States. And this allows a language called Gullah, which is sort of a polyglot, a language of various linguistic influences from Africa and from America to sort of emerge. And it, of course, as you know, it's still there, and people still speak Gullah. I'm sure you know much more about this than I do. And so one of the reasons why this culture flourished was because it was in isolation for many, many decades. That's not always the case. By the 19th century, things start to change. But in the 18th century, these communities are isolated black communities, which leads to very interesting cultural developments. Yes?
What exactly inspired you to write this particular book?
What inspired me to write this novel? The discovery. I was reading I pilfered from my parents' bookshelf when I was a young man. I was always stealing books from the bookshelves. I'd take something, I say that fondly, I'd take a book from the shelves and take it with me to go somewhere else in the world, and it'd be sort of a way to connect with my parents, to take one of the books and read it while I was traveling or living somewhere else in the world. And one of these books talked about the Black Loyalists and talked about how after serving the British in the war and fleeing to Nova Scotia, they went to Africa, but how many of these people who traveled to Africa from Nova Scotia, having previously been in the States, were born in Africa. And I started to imagine a woman caught up in this incredible migration. And we've all heard endless stories about the movement of African people in chains into the Americas, but very few of us have heard the story of how a select number managed to get back home in the same lifetime in which they were abducted. And this back and forth across the ocean journey seemed to me so miraculous and so untold that this was a story that sort of inspired me to dig down and imagine a woman caught up in this transatlantic migration in the 18th century. So that was a discovery that inspired me to write the novel. Yes.
What inspired you to write the novel so graphically?
What inspired me to write the novel so graphically? Well, that's a difficult question. You need to be careful in writing about painful things, not to batter the reader over the head so much that they want to just close the book and run. And so you can't, trying to write about violence and horror, I think you have to find a way to let some shafts of light in to the story, but not in a way that trivializes the human experience. And so, is it graphic? Yes. Is it overly graphic? I hope not, because I hope that it holds the reader throughout and it's not so depressing that a reader's reaction would be, I just can't take this anymore, I have to shut the book. And so you have to walk a really delicate line when you're writing about pain. You can't hammer the reader so hard that they don't want to continue, but you don't want to trivialize a real story either. So walking that line is tricky. So I guess it requires, in the case of this novel, some elements of very graphic, brutal writing, but other moments in which light or love or a bit of laughter or irony are allowed to seep through the story. I think we're at the end of our time, and I know there's a reception coming. I'd be happy to answer any questions individually if you'd like to ask them. I know that there are some books available at the back of the room as well, and it's my great honor to come to Georgia Perimeter College twice in the same year. So thank you so much for welcoming me.